Good day. This is Dimitri Lascaris coming to you for Reason to Resist from Montreal, Canada on November 2nd, 2025. On October 30th, in the South Korean city of Busan, Donald Trump met with Chinese President Xi Xinping for the first time since 2019. Just 2 weeks prior to this meeting, the Rand Corporation, a highly influential outfit in Washington, weighed in on the future of U.S.-China relations in a paper titled Stabilizing the U.S.-China Rivalry. In essence, the authors of that paper argued that, quote, it might be possible to find limited mechanisms of stabilization across several specific issue areas, close quote. So what was actually agreed by Xi and Putin following the issuance, by Xi and Trump following the issuance of this Rand Corporation report? And was Trump's approach to that key meeting consistent with the recommendation of the Rand study? We'll dive into that question today. We'll also examine recent developments in U.S. threats against Venezuela, new revelations regarding Jeffrey Epstein, Israel and Russia, and the tough medicine Russia's central bank recently prescribed for the Russian economy. And to help us unpack these developments, we've invited back onto our program the one and only John Helmer. John is the longest continuously serving foreign correspondent in Russia, and the only Western journalist to direct his own bureau independent of national or commercial ties. Born and educated in Australia, then at Harvard University, John has also been a professor of political science, sociology, and journalism, and an advisor to governments. He has also published several books on military and political topics, including the wonderfully named Long Live Novichok, the British Poison Which Fooled the World. Thank you for joining us again today, John.
Thank you for having me again, Dimitri. Good to be back.
So, John, I'd like to begin with the Rand Corporation's new study on U.S.-China relations. I call it a study charitably. I'm not sure that it actually deserves to be described in that way. Now, its authors do not go so far as to counsel a dramatically new approach to China. They're not arguing that the U.S. should seek peaceful coexistence with China. It seems to me their ambitions are far more limited. And at the outset of their report, they write as follows: we began this project with a very different assumption that stabilizing an ongoing rivalry is not only possible, but can serve the interests of both sides. Indeed, it's essential if conflict is to be avoided in a bitter global rivalry. The RAND project staff and other U.S. participants are deeply aware of China's hostile, predatory, and sometimes aggressive actions, and that it is imperative for the U.S. to stand up to specific forms of bullying and manipulation. Our focus is not on ways to transcend or overcome the essential geopolitical disagreement at the core of the rivalry. Even short of transformation, we did not assume that a comprehensive agenda for coexistence, shifting the rivalry to a much less intense form of competition, was plausible at this stage. Our goal in developing an agenda of stabilization was limited. We do not believe that collaborative coexistence is possible today. So there you have it, folks. This is not a peacenik initiative by any stretch of the imagination. And then, John, as you may well have seen, after setting forth their key findings, the authors issue 6 recommendations, which I'm just going to briefly put up on the screen. Clarify U.S. objectives in the rivalry with language that explicitly rejects absolute versions of victory and accepts the legitimacy of the Chinese Communist Party. That's an interesting one, John, because I didn't know that the U.S. government denied its legitimacy. Then reestablish several trusted lines of communication, improve crisis management practices, seek specific new agreements, a combination of formal public accords and private understandings to limit the U.S.-China cyber competition, declare mutual acceptance of strategic nuclear deterrence, and a willingness to forswear technologies and doctrines that would place the other side's nuclear deterrent at risk. And finally, seek modest cooperative ventures on issues of shared interest or humanitarian concern. So, John, what do you make of this RAND study, not just its content, but also its timing? And do you believe that this is likely to result in the Trump administration adopting a less hostile posture towards China? In fact, have you seen evidence of that already?
Absolutely not. This is a study that's possibly well-meaning, but utterly naive. Let me explain why. First, you look at anything that comes up like this and you ask yourself, where did the money come from for this? This is a RAND study conducted by three people. Michael Mazar. I'm having to look down, folks, at piles of paper spread across my desk to cover all the important topics that Dimitri's mentioned. So just forgive me when I don't look at you or Dimitri, because I have to look at the papers and I don't remember everybody's names. This RAND study was composed by a man called Michael Mazar, a woman called Amanda Kerrigan, and another man called Benjamin Lanayin. Now, these people have next to no connection to any form of government experience. Mazar was a special assistant to the Joint Chiefs of Staff between 2008 and 2010. That's a long time ago. Ms. Kerrigan used to work for the Center for Naval Analyses. That's as close as she got to anybody who waves a gun at China. I can't find much at all about the third author, Benjamin Lanayin. I can tell you that the money for this was paid for by something called the Broadreach Foundation. Now, that's a bag of family money created by a Harvard graduate named David Richards, now dead, who's been succeeded in running this foundation by his son, Peter, who's an actor and film producer. The bag of money that David Richards assembled is $221 million. And Richards has been putting some of the earnings on that bag of money. How he earned it, I don't know. And it's not clear from my bio checks, other than his having been involved in investment funds based in California. $221 million buys you a lot of influence and interest if you pump it into something like RAND. And David Richards bought a study for RAND on how to create a Palestinian state. That's his last big initiative before this one. This one appears to have been run and paid for by the Richards money by three people who don't have any real contact or connection to the US policymaking establishment, the US military, the US Congress, or anyone. In fact, when you look carefully at the small print, its method is basically read what the Chinese have been saying. That's reading. Then put a bunch of focus groups together of what I'm looking down at called US and Chinese scholars, outlining the potential for stabilization in three areas: Taiwan, South China Sea, and scientific technology competition. If that's the method and that's the money, there's no connection at all to the Trump administration, to the Pentagon, to the State Department, or to anyone. What does that produce? Well, it produces some well-meaning crisis reduction ideas that don't have any connection to the reality of US policymaking, allied policymaking, or adversary policymaking. In 115 pages, there are just 4 mentions of Russia, lifted out of what these 3 academics have read. There's nothing wrong with any of this. It's just not connected to the real world, not at all connected to the real world. And as you said, Dimitri, at the beginning, it's trying to take the edge off US competition, conflict, and war making with China, as if that's entirely isolated and subject to intelligent, reasonable people agreeing. Well, they don't. So from a Russian point of view, which is what I must reflect, because this is where I sit, it's a well-meaning irrelevance. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, what took place in in Busan, when President Trump met President Xi the other day, is a very serious set of lessons for Russia and for everyone who faces Trump attacks on their trade, their economy, and so forth.
John,
So,
before you address those lessons, because I did now want to turn to Busan, and this is a good time for us to do that. But I wanted to invite your observations about the aftermath of this meeting before we get into what you think those lessons are, which is really obviously critically important. So I would like to show you, I'm sure you've seen it, John, some footage of Xi and Trump shaking hands after they met in Busan.
yes.
Now, you've always been a keen observer of demeanor and body language, John. And by the way, one thing that's interesting, I don't see anybody who appears to be American Secret Service agents. I see men who could very well be Secret Service agents of the Korean government or the Chinese government or both. In any case, what do you make, before we get into the substance of this meeting, what actually happened in substance, what did you make of the body language such as you observed it?
Well, you showing the end of the meeting as Xi and Trump part company, and Xi heads towards his car, if I'm not mistaken. The body language is more visible at the beginning when Xi makes Trump wait unaccompanied, alone on the stage in front of the press, and Trump is made to wait 30 seconds. Then Xi shows up. And while Trump tries his best to ingratiate with Xi, this is obvious with the attempts at smiling that Trump does. And there's some uncharacteristic smiles on Trump's face. Xi refuses to smile. So one of the 10 no's that the Chinese conveyed to the United States during this 1 hour, 40-minute meeting, and that's not very long to discuss or let alone agree on anything. One of the big Chinese no's is no smiling. This was a completely cold reception by the Chinese side of the President of the United States, who tried to be smiling, ingratiating in a way that has been reciprocated by just about everybody in the world when they've met with Trump, including President Vladimir Putin of Russia. Mm-hmm. When Trump, in the scene that you, at the beginning of the meeting, pats Xi on the back, Xi reacts negatively. You can see him winch. There are various other words I could use for it, but he didn't like being tapped on the back. When President Trump tapped the King of England on the back, he didn't mind at all, although that's a breach of protocol in handling British royalty. So Xi showed a level of coldness, resistance, and unwillingness to allow Trump his usual forms of performance in a meeting. And that's very interesting because it symbolized exactly what didn't happen at the meeting, which are the other 9 Chinese no's. No agreements on any of the major conflicts, but agreement to postpone for enough time to negotiate a more amenable outcome.
Before you continue with the no's, can we just listen to what Trump said about what they supposedly agreed?
Yes, and then let's listen on the aircraft coming home. Yes.
Exactly. Here's what he said.
We agreed that he was going to work very hard to stop the flow. You know, it's a very complex subject because it's used for lots of different reasons, including anesthetics and things. But he's going to work very hard on it, precursors, and I think you're going to see some real action taken. I've agreed, as you know, I put a 20% tariff on China because of the fentanyl coming in, which is it's a big tariff. And based on his statements today, I reduced it by 10%, so it's 10% instead of 20% effective immediately. I believe he's going to work very hard to stop the death that's coming in.
What will your new tariff rate on China's goods be once you
It's the
sign the
same,
deal?
other than what the tariffs remain exactly the same.
55%.
It's about no, it was 57, now it's 47.
So just before asking my question, John, I just want to point out something. You know, I have not seen an explicit allegation that sort of the finished fentanyl product is coming from China into the United States. What I keep seeing over and over again is this word precursors. And
Yes.
I was suspicious about that from the outset. And my suspicions have just been confirmed in this excerpt. Trump says that these so-called precursors have legitimate uses, one of which is anesthetic.
Yes.
So
Yes.
this whole business, I mean, you know, fentanyl from China, whatever. Feel free to comment on that. But what, in fact, based on your understanding, and particularly what the Chinese have said about this meeting, what is your understanding about the messages that were conveyed in any agreements that were struck?
Well, let me run through the summary, the 10 no's, because the official Chinese and the Chinese state media editorials are glossing and are trying to be polite. Trump's been more specific in the Air Force One interview that you just excerpted, but is evasive on the key issues. So that the 10 no's that are described in the Dances with Bears piece that's on my website, Dances with Bears, 10 no's are: no Chinese congratulations for Trump's peacemaking in the Middle East or Africa. That contrasts with President Putin's congratulations and with just about everybody else's congratulations for the alleged peacemaking. No Chinese nomination for a Nobel Peace Prize. That's, again, a contrast with just about everybody, including the Europeans, who've tried to ingratiate with Trump by congratulating him on his peacemaking and putting him up for a Nobel Peace Prize. There was no Chinese promise to invest in the United States. There was no Chinese agreement, and this is very important, that happened, Trump revealed it on the aircraft, no Chinese agreement to cut its oil trade with Russia. Indeed, Trump made the point after your excerpt on fentanyl that China needs Russian oil for its own domestic economy in the north of China. This has tremendous implications for Russia, and it has tremendous implications for India. The entire thrust of Trump's current escalation of economic warfare against Russia has been based on persuading China and India to stop buying Russian oil and intercept Russian tankers and so forth and so on, something we've talked about the last time. China said, no, we won't cut Russian oil trade. There was no discussion at all, said Trump in the aircraft, of territorial concessions in the Ukraine and Taiwan. There was no agreement on the TikTok sale and no agreement on the Chinese ban for NVIDIA's Blackwell chips. So the fundamental high-tech competition that's underway between the two states was left for future negotiation. There were no U.S. port sanctions on Chinese vessels. That's another threat that Trump was imposing on the massive fees on Chinese vessels arriving in U.S. ports. There were no bribes, no Trump golf course, no Trump hotel in China, no crypto deals, none of the stuff that Trump has been promoting in the United Kingdom and elsewhere. There were no dates for an exchange of state visits. that the approximate date was put for a possible exchange visit was put off until next April, but nothing firm. And finally, the 10th no smiles. So what instead happened was that the Chinese conceded that they would buy US soybeans. But as the Dances with Bears analysis shows, the Chinese offer on accepting US soybean trade again is roughly a fraction of what the soybean trade was several years ago, spread out over 4 years, which is a considerably more time than the soybean trade at the $34-35 billion level used to be conducted. So the Chinese provided a half a plate of soybeans, not the full plate at all, and not the restoration for US farm exports of anything like the level of the soybean trade that was accepted before. Second, they've agreed to go on talking, and you saw this continuous tense that, pardon me, Trump used, go on talking about all the things they didn't agree with. In other words, in 1 hour, 40 minutes, there was no fundamental agreement on any fundamental kinds of conflicts. And what's more, Trump reiterates, he's reduced the tariff punishment for China as an adversary from 57, he said, to 47%. That's a very heavy duty. That's a very heavy penalty. And he's saying, I lifted it because they've agreed to work on reducing the amount of fentanyl precursor chemicals exported to Latin America, whence they come allegedly into the United States. Now, China knows very well that the fentanyl excuse is used by Trump to mobilize for war against Venezuela, where China is the largest of the international investors in that country. Mm-hmm. China did not mention Venezuela. Xi did not mention Venezuela in the discourse. So, but if you read for fentanyl, you read regime change in Venezuela, because that's what Trump is doing. Then you say, what does China mean by saying we will work on the limitation of fentanyl precursors to Latin America? Answer, it's unclear whether Xi supported Maduro and told Trump not to try regime change. That's important because there's no sign that the Chinese want to publicize that they warned Trump off attempting to kill the president of Venezuela and attempt a regime change. Over this past few days, since Friday, there have been statements by the Russian Foreign Ministry spokesman, Maria Zakharova, and the foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, going a little further than Russia has gone until now, warning the United States against what Zakharova called on Saturday excessive force in anti-drug operations. Now, basically, Russia and China, and to a much lesser extent Iran, are seeking to bolster Venezuelan defense from this massive attempt, this massive show of force. And I think we're up to 15 violent attacks by the US Navy on so-called Venezuelan speedboats, but they're not, to stop the alleged fentanyl trade into the United States, which is not coming from either Venezuela or Colombia. It comes across the land border by car. But in any event, fentanyl, when used by Trump, means his attacks on Venezuela, and secondarily, as everyone knows, in Canada, against Canada. So fentanyl is Trump a short term for war against his adversaries. The principal one now is Venezuela. The secondary one is Canada. That's what fentanyl means. However, the Chinese don't reflect support for President Maduro, their ally.
Mm-hmm.
Well, does that answer your question? A lot of Chinese knows, a lot of absence of truth-telling on either the Chinese side or the US side about the state of relations after one of the coldest head of state meetings I've seen in a long time.
Mm-hmm. I just want to reference here, since you raised China's support for Venezuela, this report, which was published by the Washington Post a couple of days ago. And it says that Venezuela is pleading for help with from both Moscow and Beijing. And the article says this. It says, based on internal U.S. government documents obtained by the Washington Post, and that's all they say about the material, Maduro is reaching out to Russia, China, and Iran to enhance its war and military capabilities and solicit assistance, requesting defensive radars, aircraft repairs, and potentially missiles. According to the Post, Russia remains the primary lifeline for Maduro. That's what they say. And they say that on Sunday, an Ilyushin, I guess this would have been this past Sunday, a week ago.
Yes.
An Ilyushin 276, one of the Russian aircraft sanctioned in 2023 by the U.S. for participating in the arms trade and transporting mercenaries, arrived in Caracas after a circuitous route over Africa to avoid Western airspace. The Kremlin declined to comment on the matter, but the Russian foreign minister on Friday, I think this is what you referenced a moment ago, John, said that Moscow supports Venezuela, quote, in defending its natural sovereignty, close quote, and stands ready to respond appropriately to the requests of our partners in light of emerging threats. I have not seen, and evidently neither of you, a comparable statement in any context from the Chinese government. Do you think that nonetheless do you think that it may well be that China is providing this kind of support to Venezuela but simply doesn't want to publicize it?
I don't. You're asking me to be an expert on internal Chinese politics, and I can't. I don't. So my best answer is I don't know. What we're talking about here, and I can add a bit more about the Russian side, because the statement of Friday by Zakharova was made more explicit on Saturday, but still the Russian position as Maria Zakharova articulated on Saturday is opposition to excessive force. That implies that there's a level of force that Russia accepts in anti-drug operations. She does not say that the entire US rationale for putting pressure on Venezuela is false. But by making President Maduro allegedly the head of a drug smuggling cartel, the US is claiming the right to overthrow Maduro. And I'll come back to what the scenarios for that might be like and what Russia can do about it if they choose, and what Maduro has asked for help to deal with. But there's no statement from Russia saying as clearly as you and I are just talking that the fentanyl rationale is fake. There's no statement from Russia that the anti-drug operation is in fact the cover for an attack on Venezuela's sovereignty and security. Now, what Russia has done is to endorse and support Venezuela's sovereignty. When I wrote a piece at the beginning of October, about October 11, pardon me, Russia had not ratified the agreement that President Putin and President Maduro had signed, a strategic partnership between Russia and Venezuela, which had been signed in May. The Venezuelans had ratified it, the Russians had not. Since that was written, Russia has, on October 27, that's last week, ratified the agreement. Now, the agreement does not bind Russia to do anything but coordinate, discuss, consult on Venezuelans' defense. So if our audience wants to read the text of the agreement, go to Dances with Bears website, and you'll find back in early October a piece on what that agreement said. But prior to the Washington Post coming up with a draft of Maduro's letter for help, there have been reports in the New York Times back at the beginning of October that Maduro had written to Trump offering to kick out essentially Russian and Chinese oil and other investment concession holders, oil, gold, and other mining and minerals concessions in that country, and replace them with American ones. That was the alleged text of Maduro's offer to Trump. Trump then refused the offer, withdrew Richard Grenell, the special negotiator for reaching business and peacemaking deals with the Maduro government, withdrew him, and then mobilized and escalated on the military front.
What is the source of this allegation, John, that Maduro made this offer to the Americans?
The New York Times ran the story.
Right. So as far as you know, there's no confirmation of this from the Venezuelan government, I imagine.
Not exactly, no.
Right.
And the New York Times reporter, I believe it was Julian Barnes, there were a couple of others, the national security reporters for the New York Times, including Barnes, have made a record of lying and running false claims in the past. So that particular, quotes, draft letter has to be understood as potentially disinformation to split Maduro from Putin and Maduro from Xi.
Exactly.
The Washington Post piece doesn't have any more credibility either. Nothing that comes from the United States media, certainly not from Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, New York Times, the mainstream media, can be taken at face value. There is a war against Maduro, and it's taking different forms, and these newspapers have to be understood to be part of that war. But let's get down to some basics here. There are, in preparation for our talk today, I've talked to some Russian sources in a position to know, and there are a couple of different views privately on what Russia can do, what Russia can't do, what Russia doesn't want to extend any publicly or even privately, what its capabilities are for supporting Maduro while it tries to finish the war in the Ukraine, the war that Europe and the United States are fighting against Russia. So there are two different Russian views. One is that Trump will try to obliterate the Maduro government. Obliterate's a favorite Trump word. It's Trumpian escalation beyond shock and awe, an old-fashioned Pentagon term for how you intimidate and destroy your adversary in the Middle East. The idea of obliteration can be inferred from the level of military escalation that's been building up in the Caribbean Sea off Venezuela in preparation for some combination of massive missile attacks, naval bombardments, air bombardments to destroy the Maduro regime in its bunkers. So there's one version that the Russian understanding that's what the US and that's what Trump will do. Second, there's another version, and that goes back to the reference to the Ilyushin aircraft that landed last week. This is that what the US would do follows a kind of Israel-US playbook for Iran. It will first increase the internal covert operations of the CIA and develop something like what I might call a Machado Maidan. Maria Machado, the so-called US recognized opposition leader, Nobel Peace Prize winner for this year, would make a rally in which people would be killed, in which it would be accused, in which the Maduro security forces would be accused of being the gunman, much as Maidan was accused to have been a military operation, a police operation by the Yanukovych regime as part of the run-up to an appeal for the overthrow. So what might happen would be something like a Machado Maidan, fostered, developed, and manipulated by the CIA and by special forces employed to kill. Machado would then appeal to Donald Trump to intervene to save lives, and then the intervention would proceed, which would include the Marine Expeditionary Force that's offshore, ready to land. Whether you see a kind of stepwise internal operation appealing for intervention, or whether you see an obliteration operation, or whether you see them both together, what's feasible for Russia and China to do to deter the United States? As you say, the Chinese appear not to be attempting publicly to deter Trump from doing anything to Venezuela. Second, what can Russia do? It is now clear over the last 4 days, including the statements that you've referred to, especially from the foreign ministry in Moscow. There's, let's say, a rhetorical support for defending Venezuela's sovereignty. Is there the military capability quickly to rebuild, revitalize Venezuela's Soviet-supplied, Russian-supplied Sukhoi aircraft? Can it be done quickly? Not likely. Can enough drones and missile supplies be provided to mount a deterrent air defense on the Venezuelan side? That would require Russian intelligence. It would require Russian radar and electronic interception capabilities, and it would expose Russians to US attack. It would also expose US aircraft, naval vessels to Venezuelan / assisted by Russia counterattacks. Can the prospect of having US aircraft downed by Venezuelan defenses deter Trump? Can the Russian secret assistance to Venezuela put Trump in a position where he faces the Bay of Pigs risk? In other words, a level of self-defense by Venezuela, as Cuba was able to mobilize itself against JFK's initial CIA-driven Bay of Pigs invasion. Can Russia assist Venezuela, A, to develop the real capability, and B, to develop a significant deterrent capability that Trump would be facing a Bay of Pigs? Now ask ourselves, could Trump run a Bay of Pigs risk? Answer, I don't think he would. I don't think he could. His performance in Busan shows that the man can have his bluff called, and he retreats. That can be done by the most powerful adversary in the world, in economic terms, China. Can it be done by a relatively small country like Venezuela? only with Russian assistance. Is this ongoing? Did the arrival of the Aleutian mean more than ongoing arms supplies, ongoing technical assistance? I don't know. And the Russian side is not prepared to say more at this stage. Certainly nothing like the level of support that's in the Russian agreement with North Korea, or even the Russian agreement with Iran. However, one has to put on one side the scenario of a Machado Maidan, and on the other side, the risk of the Bay of Pigs risk. And we then have to say, what will Trump do to run this risk? And what will President Putin do to enhance the risk and thus increase the deterrent capability? And then finally, what has President Xi said when he had the opportunity in 1 hour, 40 minutes to deter President Trump from attacking a very significant, more than 20 billion, but others can correct me, it may be more or less, Chinese investment in Venezuela. What did President Xi have to say about Venezuela that President Trump might have heard and now have to calculate for his ongoing operations against Venezuela? If it was nothing, it would be reasonable for the US side to infer they have a green light flashing from China to do what the US wants to do against Venezuela. Now, I don't know that that's the case, but what we've just said is something that isn't being said enough in our alternative media, is it? Was there a Xi green light for Trump to do whatever he wants in Venezuela? And taking into account that question, we have to point out that Russia has done more.
Yes, and it would be quite something, it seems to me, if China did implicitly give a green light, because, the U.S. approach to the sphere of influence of China is infinitely more aggressive. I mean, Venezuela is a sovereign country, whereas Taiwan, which gets weapons, billions of dollars of weapons from the U.S. government, including under Trump, is actually part of China. So why China would hesitate with its capabilities to, at least express opposition to Trump's blatantly criminal war of aggression on Venezuela is just mystifying to me. I don't know why they wouldn't at least give moral support to the government of Maduro, but hey, man, maybe there's some trade-off here. The Chinese are getting some benefit from their apparent, passivity in the face of these threats towards Venezuela. Any comment on that?
Well, the Chinese, I think you're right to raise all these questions, Dimitri. And perhaps we're alone in the podcast universe of pointing out that there seem to be in this particular zoo 3 paper tigers. The 3 paper tigers: Trump, Putin, and Xi, at least on the Venezuelan issue. And this raises the important question you've just hinted at. If China and Russia let the US make a regime change, just kill President Maduro and destroy the Venezuelan government and replace it with Mrs. Machado or something else, what's the credibility of the two of the 3 powers in BRICS to assist anyone, even themselves? Well, that's the paper tiger aspect. Since President Trump has accused President Putin of being a paper tiger, he made a pretty good demonstration of what paper tigers look like when he met with President Xi in Busan. Now, what do we have? President Trump's policy has been to destroy the credibility of multilateralism expressed as BRICS, for example. And if it's the case that neither China nor Russia can deter, nor BRICS, Brazil, India, and the others, Iran, can deter the United States from invading Venezuela and destroying its sovereign government, if they can't, then BRICS is a paper tiger too. Now, there are implications for India, which we haven't gotten to discuss yet. And the RAND study doesn't mention anything to do with India. It doesn't mention all of the aggressive operations the United States is running against India, particularly the new buildup of Pakistan as a new US warfighting platform against Afghanistan, against Iran, against India, and so on. All of that's missing from the so-called RAND study on China. But the Venezuelan issue is both a crucial test of paper tiger quality on the part of all the great powers now, China, Russia, and the United States. And we're here today. We don't know what will happen tomorrow, but what we know is the events are rushing fast, and we've said about as much as we know we can justify on the evidence now.
You know, I don't know if you're aware of this, John, but I was in Venezuela last year as an election observer when President Maduro was reelected. As I've reported, I was invited by the Socialist Party of Venezuela, the ruling party, to come to the country as an observer. Neither I nor any of the many foreign election observers I interacted with on that trip saw any evidence of electoral fraud. Now, that doesn't mean we can, certify with a certainty that the result was reflective of the actual vote, because we don't have insight or access to the inner workings of the Electoral Commission. We can only tell people what we saw on the ground when we went to voting stations and so forth. In any case, and as I say, the voting was very orderly and peaceful, and we saw no evidence of electoral fraud. In any case, what I can say is this: there is a core of Venezuelan society, beyond a shadow of a doubt. We can debate whether it's 70% or 25% or 30%. There is a significant core of Venezuelan society that is very committed to the Bolivarian revolution, as Chavez styled it. And quite apart from that, there's significant nationalist feeling in Venezuela, whether people actually support Maduro or don't. And if they attempt to overthrow Maduro by violence, I have two observations about that. They may not be happy with the person who replaces Maduro. So that person may end up being somebody who's even less to the liking of the United States government. They can't really control, if there's chaos in Venezuela, how all that's going to play out. We've seen this again and again in other attempts at violent regime change. But the other observation I have is I can think of no more effective way to exacerbate enormously the flow of illegal migrants from Latin America to the United States than to plunge Venezuela into a condition of chaos and violence. And this, it seems to me, all these people out there, any people out there listening to us today who support, I doubt there are many in our audience, John, but who may support attempts to remove Maduro from power, and who at the same time are on board with Trump's policies towards migrants in the United States, very hostile, downright abusive from a human rights perspective. There's a fundamental contradiction there. If you want the U.S. government to get a better handle on illegal immigration, the last thing you want to do is plunge Venezuela into a state of chaos. I think already there's a very large number of Venezuelans in the United States, in part because of the suffering that U.S. sanctions have inflicted upon the country. Anyways, those are just my observations. I would like to move back for a moment and away from the subject of Venezuela. I just want to clarify a couple of things with you. I may have missed it, but in your discussion of what was actually agreed and not agreed, I don't think you talked about rare earth metals. Do you understand that the Chinese have made any commitment to lift restrictions on rare earth metals coming from China to the West, and particularly the United States?
Yes, it would appear to me, from what President Trump said in the interview on Air Force One coming home from Busan, and also from the Chinese media, the official editorials, that the Chinese side lifted its ban on export of rare earth minerals to the United States. And it did so for an express purpose of negotiating a larger trade agreement. And it did so with the limitation that this must take place within 12 months. So from a Trump point of view, he's won a Chinese concession. From a Chinese point of view, and from everyone else's point of view, we have to see that China has maintained escalation dominance in the trade war. Why? Because they've said, we aren't agreeing yet on any of the major trade war sanctions you've raised and imposed on us. You are still pursuing trade war, but we will hold fire for a period of 12 months to enable you and us to come to an agreement. But we could resume our ban on rare earth metals and minerals the minute we have concluded you're not negotiating in good faith. Mm-hmm. So essentially, it's a ceasefire while allowing only a limited amount of time to accomplish an express purpose. And China maintains the conditionality. We will bang on again the ban on rare earth mineral exports to the United States if you don't agree and come to an agreement. Now, immediately I see President Trump's concession language in the interview you just excerpted, overruled or changed by the Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent's statement. The headline is China made a bad mistake in using its rare earth minerals export ban as a weapon. Well, they didn't make a mistake because the US has agreed to a limited time period to negotiate a trade agreement which doesn't have a 47% tariff penalty, along with all the other smaller ones that are significant for both sides, trade, investment relations, and so on. So, yes, there's a Chinese concession, but in context, China demonstrates that they think they control the forward movement of the negotiations, and that's the truth.
Mm-hmm. So let's move on then. Unfortunately, I only have about 15 minutes left, but I have two other subjects I wanted to cover with you today, John. And the first one is this quite explosive revelation coming from Dropsite News that Jeffrey Epstein acted as an intermediary between Israel and Russia, apparently at the behest of former Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak. Here's the article from Dropsite News. You'll see how the sex trafficker helped Israel build a back channel to Russia amid Syrian civil war. And these revelations are based on emails that were obtained. I believe it was through an Iran-affiliated, and I'm not saying necessarily affiliated with the government, but apparently has some connection to the country of Iran, a hacker group by the name of Handala, if I'm not mistaken. So, presumably this is pretty reliable information, although I haven't yet seen the emails. These are coming directly, apparently, from Ehud Barak's emails.
Yes.
So according to Dropsite News, Epstein was successful in securing a private meeting between Barak and Russian President Vladimir Putin to discuss a Russian brokered end to the conflict, including winning Russian support for a negotiated removal of Syrian President Bashar al-Assad. Dropsite also reports, however, that despite securing a sit-down with President Putin in the summer of 2013, they did not succeed in convincing Russia to support Assad's ouster, but their negotiations set the stage for US-Russia cooperation on disarmament of Syria's chemical weapons arsenal a few months later. So, John, I'm interested in any thoughts you might have about these revelations, but I'm particularly interested in one, I must say, unseemly aspect of all of this. And that is in 2008, several years before Epstein attempted to facilitate this meeting, he pled guilty to state charges of solicitation of prostitution and of solicitation of prostitution with a minor under the age of 18 and was sentenced to 18 months in prison. Now, if Dropsite's report is accurate, and I have no reason to doubt its veracity, this means that the Kremlin was persuaded by a notorious pedophile to facilitate communications between Netanyahu and the Russian government. Quite apart from the fact I find that unseemly, I'm having difficulty understanding why Epstein would need to play any role in this at all. Why couldn't the Israeli government simply reach out to the Russian government directly to initiate these discussions? Because it's not, my understanding is they never actually formally experienced a rupture in diplomatic relations. They've always maintained communications. I just, on the one hand, I see no reason to doubt the veracity of the story, but I'm befuddled by it, John. I mean, why would Epstein have any role in this at all?
You raise some important points, Dimitri, so let me try to respond. In the first place, it's very important for our audience to understand we're talking about a time period between 2013 and 2015. That's the period of time in which Barak's inbox has been raided and some of the emails surfaced. That's the first point. Second point is the outcome. Everything they attempted to persuade Russia to do failed. Everything the Israelis thought they could get Epstein's help to achieve for the overthrow of the Assad government in Damascus failed. So there's a third point, and that is they were all attempting to make money. This is a collection of emails illustrating how a retired Israeli prime minister and defense minister operating 2 or 3 consulting companies, which Epstein helped finance along with others, attempted to make money. This is all the emails are about money making. Sex is simply one of the ways in which Epstein rewarded people for delivering money or for accepting money to advance a variety of interests. These are emails between con men and hustlers. That's what you have to understand. Barak is simply a con man attempting to fill his own pockets. Now, one of the emails indicates that Barak was not only getting finance from Epstein for his pocket, he was approaching Viktor Vekselberg, a significant Russian oligarch level businessman, to pay him a consulting fee to achieve a variety of Vekselberg's economic and business and commercial objectives. And Barak is clear he was receiving $1 million per month for a possibly limited retainer in the period around 2015 for Vekselberg's commercial advantage through Vekselberg's holding company called Renova. Perhaps Epstein thought that Vekselberg was very close to or influential in the Kremlin and could influence President Putin. He'd be wrong about that, but that's Russian politics. And this is about Israeli money and Epstein's money. And that's what this is about. And as far as it goes, the money failed to produce a significant political outcome. Just as you said, Dimitri, why couldn't the Israeli government at the time deal directly with President Putin? Well, of course it did. Now, there are some interesting tidbits from a Russian political point of view on who Epstein was able to arrange for Barak to meet, or for Barak. Bear in mind, Barak and Epstein are con men, hustlers. They're always exaggerating to each other how influential they are, because they try to turn influence into cash. That's what they're doing. That's what this is about. It's manipulating the perception of power connection and turn it into personal money making. That's what this is about. And Barak was attempting to draw Epstein's money into his businesses in his pocket. And he met, I'm just picking up a June 2015 Barak email to Epstein. I've great meetings he's had in St. Petersburg. I've met Sergei. That's a man called Sergei Belyakov, a man with an FSB KGB background who's currently involved in a range of businesses in cyber investment. I've met SS. I don't know who SS is code for, but I believe it might have been President Putin. I'm guessing. He expressed interest in finding some area for actual cooperation. Oh, yeah. How can you hustle that into money? Only by telling Epstein, I'm big, I've just met SS, and he wants actual cooperation. So maybe we can get together and make some more money here out of Putin. Okay. And then what does Barak say he did? He met with the central bank governor, Mrs. Nabiullina, and Foreign Minister Lavrov. Both very good, says Barak. I've also met briefly with Kudrin, then a significant financial policy maker in President Putin's government, Kostin, then the boss of the state VTB bank, and Gref, then the head of Sberbank. Now, what's that mean? It means that at a St. Petersburg investment forum designed to attract money into investment in Russia, an Israeli who's hustling for money to go into his pocket, not to go into Russia, has been given access to the let's call it pro-Western US investment favorable members of the Russian government. Kudrin, Kostin, Gref, Nabiullina. Okay, right. This is all about money, and it all failed. So what this story isn't going to make a lot of, clickbait audience unless it's promoted in a different direction. It's about the way in which Israeli money and a sex trafficking Jewish financier in New York tried to make money out of Russia, met some of the people who might have been helpful. I might add Yuri Ushakov seems, as foreign advisor to President Putin, one of the go-betweens. This is a back channel that went nowhere for the Israeli, for the American, for the Russians too. But that isn't going to make clickbait, and it isn't going to generate hundreds of thousands of views on a podcast from somebody else who hasn't the brains or the ethics to understand what really happened here. A nothing burger.
Well, nonetheless, I'm quite happy to have asked you this question, because now it makes a lot more sense to me than it did before. Now, with that, I'd like to move on. You mentioned Nabiullina, the head of the central bank, so that's a good place for us to end our discussion today. And I unfortunately not going to have a lot of time to dig into this because we've covered the other issues so thoroughly. But you published an article, and I'll just put it up on the screen here. I thought was quite informative about the economic policies and the monetary policies currently being pursued by the Russian central bank. The title of your article is "No GDP growth, no inflation, no war by 2028." Central Bank Governor Nabiullina follows U.S.
Nabiullina. Let's pronounce it. It's Nabiullina. Nabiullina. Elvira Nabiullina. That's it.
Thank you for correcting me. And then you interestingly have an image of a Trumpian Trojan horse, which presumably in your in your conception is trying to get somehow into the gates of Moscow. So in any case, you talk in this article at length about I believe it's a statement or a series of statements that the Russian central bank governor has made to the State Duma about the monetary policy of the bank in the months ahead.
Yes.
And it's quite, well, I don't know if draconian is an appropriate word, but it's rather severe, and it's going to have, according to her, rather negative consequences on Russian economic growth. Could you tell us sort of summarily, what policy is she saying the central bank is going to pursue in the near to medium term? And what impact she says this is going to have on the Russian economy?
It's very difficult to boil something as complex as monetary policy and central bank policy down so that the folks at home will understand the politics of what's happening here. What Nabiullina has done is has been to run extremely high interest rates. The so-called key interest rate of the central bank has gone, it's currently 16.5, but it has been at the level of 21%. And the article shows by charts and words that Nabiullina's policy has been to reduce inflation and use high interest rate as a way of killing demand and reducing the pressures for inflation inside the Russian economy. And in 2 reports she's issued, and then in a speech she made to the State Duma, the parliament, over the last 10 days, she's explained that her projection is for 2 years of recession from now, 2025, with a growth rate that's below the level of margin of statistical error, 0.5%, may as well be 0%, to -2% up to -3.5% in the out years, 26 and 27. No growth, no return to growth, GDP growth as measured by the central bank, until 2028. In other words, crush inflation by crushing the economy. Now, for everybody to understand at home the political significance of this, we've been overdosed with versions of the Russian economy crumbling, President Putin politically and economically vulnerable. We've been hearing that from President Trump. We heard that from NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte, who met with Trump in Washington a few days back and repeated the line. All of the Western media that trumpet NATO line argues the war with Ukraine can be continued and escalated on their side because the Russian economy is vulnerable. So what's actually going on inside the Russian economy is a completely different story. The evidence can be interpreted falsely, as the Westerners have done, as the NATO alliance is doing. But inside the Russian economy, there's a major argument, and it's a very strong argument, how that the biggest damage to the Russian economy is coming from Nabiullina's central bank and this crushing key rate. So what I've tried to do is explain how Nabiullina claims herself to be acting. And then I've run, pardon me, a group of critics of Nabiullina, not simply the Communist Party, which is politically impotent, but some significant critical economists like Mikhail Delyagin, the deputy chairman of the Duma Committee on Economic Policy, Sergei Glaziev, and others. Now, they're also economically impotent. They can't influence President Putin to change the central bank policy of high interest rates, killing internal investment in the country. They do not say, quite as much as the article reports, which has benefited from a couple of other sources to whose work I've added at the bottom of the article. The question that arises, if we've got a bit of time here, is who benefits from Nabiullina's policy? Who benefits? Well, the key rate at 21% or 16.5% or the range in between, that key rate is not the key rate that is applied to selected, favored, large businesses. Banks, including the Sberbank, the state savings bank, the biggest bank of Russia, run by German Gref, one of the people that Epstein and Barak met back in 2015. The banks are making super profits, which the critics of Nabiullina have argued encourage an atmosphere of speculation on short-term financial profit-making at the expense of internal investment. Why does President Putin support this? Answer, he doesn't. He doesn't say he supports it. Why is he supporting Nabiullina? Answer, it's not quite spelled out as simply as I'm saying now. Nabiullina is the guardian of the huge refinancing or financing requirement for war. Since 2022, it's obvious Russia has had to mobilize its industry to fight the world, to fight NATO and the United States. And it has done a terrific job. It now can produce militarily everything required to fight war at a rate that the United States and the NATO allies can't match, right? We all agree that the Russian capacity to wage this war has been extraordinary. President Putin has needed a central banker to lend money to the industry to reach that mobilization capacity, but without becoming a communist type central bank planned economy. Okay? So, in my judgment, and people are bound to disagree, and I invite disagreement, Nabiullina is President Putin's war financier at the same time as she doesn't want to fight war. She wants to cut military expenditures. She has advocated, as has her protectors, her patrons in the past, Alexei Kudrin, and before Alexei Kudrin, it was Anatoly Chubais, discredited pro-American financial advisors in the Russian government, all against the war. Nabiullina has been, contrary to their advice, contrary to her own sentiments, the principal source of war financing at discounted, subsidized, or favored interest rates way below the key rate. The key rate has crushed small and medium-sized business in Russia. Mm-hmm. The key rate and inflation have been linked by Nabiullina herself, not to business, but to state actions like raising the VAT tax on consumers. The war expenditures themselves are regarded in her reporting as inflation or pro-inflation risks. So there's a paradoxical combination of cause and effect here. She is safe from Putin intervention to get rid of her, although the key rate is crushing part of the Russian economy, because Putin trusts her to run a relatively corruption-free, relatively speaking, corruption-free war financing scheme that involves trillions of rubles. So I hope I've explained why the evidence suggests that war financing at less than 9% interest, maybe 4%, maybe 6.5%, I presented in the article you mentioned the reference to the central bank's listing of loan monies going out at different rates of interest. That shows there are different rates of interest for different purposes. That shows the use of the central bank as the war financier, but the war financier that doesn't become a state planning committee of the Soviet type. That's anathema, not only to Nabiullina, but to President Putin himself. That's the politics as I understand it.
Right. And thank you very much for that explanation. It highlights once again that the Russian economy and the government, politics generally within the Russian Federation, are much more complex than we are led to believe in the West.
Yes.
And it's important that we be reminded of that at this particular time, I think, with everything that's going on in Ukraine. In any case, John, we're out of time today. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us. As usual, it was very enlightening. And we'll be signing off today for Reason to Resist on November 2nd, 2025.
Thank you, Dimitri.